So let's see, what am I going to do tonight? Today, I want to go over the purpose of the study, give you a little bit of background and sort of the research propositions, what we're trying to do here. So fairly typical sort of review of the study. It is a paper that is currently under review, but we've got a couple of other pieces. Richard's working with us to try and get a technical report out. We've got that just about done, so that'll be coming out pretty soon. And then we have these sort of briefs that we've been preparing along the line of what the Mossbacher does. We've got that just about done as well. So there were two primary things that we were hoping to get done with the study. One was identify what I was calling key capacity elements. When I started looking at some of this stuff and laying out some of the propositions or some thoughts around capacity, when I presented this, Suyeon Jo, who's a former student now up at Syracuse, we went out to the West Coast Data Conference about 2 years ago, and we laid out something like 17 propositions of nonprofit capacity. So this was an attempt to try and identify, by listening to executives, what floats to the top of that. So the literature has a number of potential elements that would support capacity for a nonprofit organization, and capacity is broadly defined as the features or elements inside an organization that support its ability to fulfill its mission or perform its objectives. The second piece of the study was an attempt to kind of explore the viability of a conceptual model that I was using in the textbook as a way to depict capacity. There are a variety of capacity models in the literature, many of which are based on sort of consultant models where they look at what's going on and make judgments about priorities. So this was an attempt to go back to some of the org behavior literature, some of the classic, and that's what I'll lay out for you in the theoretical background, is what was the sort of theoretical framing about where this model comes from. And so that was the second thing we wanted to do. When we go out and listen to executives, does that model capture and sufficiently capture or appropriately capture what's going on? And I'll talk a little bit about what we found in reference to that. So briefly, a quick background on the way I'm approaching some of the work that we have going on is a strategic management approach, which has this first question about, there's sort of two propositions in reference to strategic management. One has to do with, we're going to be successful if we can position ourselves effectively in a market or in an industry. So as we think about very specifically in reference to positioning, should we have our store on the corner front, or where we put ourselves in a geographic space has implications for the way that people are going to find our services or access our services or buy from us. All right, in the nonprofit context, I'm framing it a little broader than that, and really thinking about the way that the organization differentiates itself from other service providers. And again, we're primarily talking about human service organizations here, although the model has applicability, I believe, across the sector. So in this question then is the degree to which the organization differentiates itself, and to some degree, from other nonprofit human service organizations. And again, that can be geographic focus. So I serve Bryan College Station. There's another organization perhaps that's located in Caldwell that serves those organizations out there. We differentiate ourselves amongst the human service organizations by serving two different populations. A fairly typical kind of thing that happens in nonprofits. This second issue has to do with how does the organization sustain itself. So thinking about those two examples again, those organizations oftentimes rely on a fair amount of money from the Health and Human Services Department, perhaps of the state, and so they see themselves as agents or contracting entities of the state, and so in some ways they might be in a similar resource domain, and it's important for nonprofits to both distinguish between the service domain, or the area where they provide services, and the financial domain. Okay, so that's context. So the organization has to think a little bit about, most of what I'm doing today isn't about context. It's a little bit more tricky, something we would like to do as we move forward. Most of what I'm going to do today is talking about internal aspects of the organization. So the other side of strategy has to do with, well, you can be successful if there are aspects or attributes of your organization that are unique or distinctive. If you have something about you that is particularly special, and we'll go through what we believe those attributes and characteristics are, you have what are called competencies or these resource elements or management functions. So the example I like to give is sort of some of the stuff that Teach for America has done in reference to the way that they were recruiting individuals into the teaching profession. So they were able to sort of operate a recruitment system which was sort of head and shoulders above what had currently been done in the past in that space of trying to find people to serve as teachers. So they differentiated themselves by the way that they treated the candidates and the mechanisms that they did to be more effective at recruiting individuals, and they became successful. So the strategy literature says you can position yourself and that can contribute to your effectiveness, or there are things about your organization and that can contribute to your effectiveness, ability to be able to perform. All right, so this study positions itself here to say what's going on in reference to these organizations, and can we identify attributes or characteristics about them that help them or facilitate them to be successful in performance. So it's based upon the resource-based perspective of an organization, resource perspective of the firm, as I was saying. It has to do with there are things about the organization. There are a variety of ways that we can sort of define or categorize these. I've went fairly broadly to talk about the extent to which an organization has human capital, financial capital, social capital, or physical capital, or there are elements that they have in reference to those. There's a fifth one here called organizational capital. And it has to do with the management systems and processes. So what I've done is I've pulled out these four here, and I call those the resource portfolio. And I'll drill into each one of these to define each so you can see what those are. And then we're going to look at the management systems or the management functions. This leads to the nonprofit value framework, which looks at the resource portfolio. So those elements of human capital, financial capital, etc. And then management functions. It's a little off balance in the sense that there's 4 elements here and 4 elements here that I want to look at. And I'll drill into each one of these to explain what I mean by each of these different functions. But this is the conceptual model that we're trying to explore or see. One of the conflicts here tends to do with, do people distinguish between attributes or characteristics or things that they own or have from the things that they do with them? So we have talented individuals in the organization, and we can utilize them in a way to put them at use or coordinate them amongst each other so that they form a good team. So teamwork, efforts to create a good team in the sense of getting people to coordinate and communicate effectively together is different from the idea that I have a lot of talented individuals. Again, if you could think of even a symphony or something where you could say, okay, we've got a lot of talented musicians, we still have to manage them in a way to be able to create beautiful music. All right, so it's both of these two, and do managers then, so one of the key questions then becomes, do managers talk about things distinct from the attributes and the management functions? Is there a distinction in the language that they use, and can we find that? That was more or less one of the things that we wanted to try and distill, and then we wanted to see which of these were priorities. So that's that diagram, that's what we're going to get into. So pretty straightforward, right? We've all heard that it's important to get the right people on the bus, and how important the people are. It has to do with the skills that individuals have, the talents that they have, knowledge, and there's an affective element too, right? People's commitment and motivations to the organization and the way that they feel attached to the organization and connected to what's going on. So we're looking to see if people talk about the people in their organization. Money obviously makes a difference. You got to have sufficient financial access to a sufficient amount of money. So one thing that we might hear people talk about is that they've got some assets or something in reference to financial capital or an endowment of some kind. The other thing that we heard quite a bit more was the way that they felt like they could control or manage revenue streams. And again, this is where it gets a little bit between, is it a management thing? Is it something that they own? Or is it something that sort of is managed. And so I put this idea of, if an organization says, I have stable, reliable revenue streams, if an organization talked about it that way, we said that was something that they had. It was a resource attribute, as opposed to when they talked about the fundraising or the contract management mechanisms that they would put in place to secure those funds. And again, the boundary between some of these things can be a little bit difficult to fully distill. And again, what we were looking for was to see some of that. Another thing that we were curious about was social capital. To what extent do individuals talk about the relationships that they have, where we work well together, so there's a sense that we are connected, we're well. So again, I gave the example of a team, but there is this idea that people like each other and communicate with each other effectively. We heard a lot about people talking in the relationship that they had with their board of directors. So that was something that would end up in this category here, or the way that people or managers would work together. Bridging relationship has to do with the external environment. To what extent do we have partnerships and relationships external to our organization, either with other organizational entities? Has to do with both providing services, but also has to do with resources. The fourth element, fairly straightforward in the sense that there's the stuff that they have, right? So information technology was the most common thing, or buildings or facilities that they had or didn't have would be some of the most common stuff that you would see here. There's a variety of other ways that you could slice some of this. Any one of those four could be sliced down into more levels of intricacy. But just to move forward with this, we tried to keep it fairly general, and that was what the 17 was when we started off. So we had unpacked some of these, and we thought it worked better to bring them back together again. So if those are the four resource attributes in the resource portfolio, then there's a set of management functions. So that one's a little bit much. But this comes back from the competing values perspective that helps us think about what's going on inside an organization and what are the functions or activities that happen in an organization. And they distinguish this between things that are a bit more inside the organization versus things that are outside, or are attempt to manage things outside the organization. So on this side you have your external relations or public relations and fundraising kinds of activities, your program activities having to do with people outside the organization. On this side you have the idea related to people in our organization, our human resource tasks, and the administrative systems within the organization. And then there's an additional quadrant where it looks at these systems need to be more flexible, these systems tend to be a little bit more tighter and a little bit more controlled in their orientation. So we'll unpack or look at each one of those just real briefly. Human resources has to do with recruitment, potentially the compensation, job design, a variety of elements that would fall into this catchment of human resource practices, and what do we hear from people in reference to what they say about the way that they manage their people. We look at the administrative systems and the policies and the procedures that they have in place, the extent to which that they feel that they can operate an efficient organization might be something that people were talking about. We looked at the extent to which they talk. This one is the most tricky for folks in these organizations, managing the external environment. As you can see, there's a lot of stuff in there, and in particular the resource, the fund development activities fall within that category to try and figure out how am I going to attend to the funders and the individuals who might support our work, whether they're donors or whether it's contracts or what have you. So that's in that third quadrant. And then this was depicted as the tip of the nonprofit value framework. So this was the stuff that was in the little arrow out in the middle, out the end, with an attempt to be able to say, okay, those are the pieces that are directly attending to the public benefit activities of the organization to achieve. We would talk about sort of number of individuals, some outputs, plus as well some outcome elements that would be on the, if you were to look at the nonprofit value framework, you could extend that out and say, okay, to what extent are we achieving outcomes or benefits from our organization? It would be as a direct result of these kinds of activities. And then laid on top of sort of that whole four quadrants is this idea of leadership, and in particular what we were asking people about, or what we heard a lot about, was the board of directors. And we did ask as well some very specific questions about the board of directors, the extent to which the board fulfills key roles and functions around oversight, around strategy, right? A lot of people talk about the extent to which the board supports resource acquisition, the extent to which we're able to get the money that we need. All right, this led to the nine propositions, one for each one of those 4 elements. 4 resource attributes and 5 management functions, including this idea of the board of directors. So with that, we went out to the field. Wasn't quite that clean, but it was more or less that was the idea. And as I said, we actually went out, well, I mean, we had between 17 and 9, right? Or more so in reference to what we could possibly do. We went out and talked to people to just get a sense about what they were doing in their organizations and what they prioritized. As we said, we had those 2 purposes. We did a couple of things to control context. Although we did get a little bit of diversity because we wanted to talk to people in 2 different regions of the state. So we've got moderate size or small size nonprofit human service organizations, average revenue of about 1.5. We ended up talking to 66 individuals, the vast majority of whom were chief executives of their organization. There was a range of organizational sizes, but that was the catchment area that we did initially to sort of truncate our sample within the state of Texas, sorry. We did 2 things. We sent out an email or a letter to those individuals and asked them a couple of very simple questions about, so this quick response survey. How effective is your organization on a scale of 1 to 7? As you can imagine, most people thought their organizations were quite successful. So we came in at 5s and 6s and 7s in reference to what they believed their organization was doing. We asked them about how effective was your board and how effective are you. I'm not going to talk much about this one today. It's an interesting second question, though, about individual capacities of the individual leaders. What we really were curious about was the most interesting part of the conversation was this question right here. So although people did a variety of things in reference to how they judged effectiveness, and we did ask that question, by and large they said something to the degree we provide services, we help people. There wasn't a lot of heavy, I can talk about the impact of my organization or in a real quantitative sort of, it was pretty soft way of framing up effectiveness. We'll talk about sort of some of the limitations, and one of them obviously has to do with this methodology and what does that mean for our ability to make judgments and extensions on some of this. But I can also talk about why we did it. I didn't want to presuppose elements of effectiveness on these individuals. If they were operating an organization, we wanted to hear about what did they think, how they were doing, and then most important to us, what factors contributed to their level of ability to function the way that they thought that they were. And I can tell you a variety of stories about sort of what some of the things we heard here. We heard some variety, but by and large, they were talking about providing services to individuals in some capacity. And this was the question that was most interesting to us. And then what we would do to push people was to ask them, okay, what makes a difference? What's important to you? What thing comes to mind? And then we would say, okay, you gave yourself a 6. What would it take to become a 7? What are you worried about to become a 5? And with that, then they would bring up 2nd and 3rd and 4th and 5th level elements that they said, these would be the other things that are of a concern to me or that I could use more of and would, if I had them, I would be more effective. Is that all right? So interviews lasted about 45 minutes. They were telephone interviews. They were done by myself and Frederick Anderson 2 summers ago, all recorded and transcribed. We use a qualitative analysis software. We went into it with a predetermined, a coding scheme. We had this sort of tree or this sort of sets of categories where we anticipated, obviously based upon those 17 propositions, because we really went into it with those. And plus others, we had sort of played around with some of this and started thinking about categories. All of this is a matter of what categories are the best way to organize this data. And it's an iterative process. So at first there was, Suyan took the lead and Taylor Hall and myself began to code a select number of them. Well, first of all, we talked about what our coding scheme was and went through the whole definition process, tried to train everybody to get people to agree on terms and phrases. And then we looked at some, we all looked at the same ones, and then talked about them again. Why did we code that one that way? And what did you mean by that? And oh, I would have coded it this way. And so we had that conversation a couple of different instances, revised it one more time, and came up with about 40 items where we thought things would fall into. And there was some broader categories. I'll show you a little bit what some of those broader categories were. Well, you've already seen them. Those broader categories, and then we had the elements within them. And it's tricky, right? Somebody starts talking about, oh, we're a family. What does that mean in reference to the staff? So how do you code that? Where does that go? And that was that process of what does that mean and what category does that fall into? And it was both some reiteration and interpretation of this kind of ongoing. And by and large, what I would do, because I wasn't involved in the direct coding, I would look at what was going on. I would reread transcripts. You can, with NVIVO, you can jump in and look at the context. So if somebody codes something and says, oh, this is saying this, you can look at the context that this is operating in. So I went in regularly and consistently now over the last probably year and a half and looked at these things and begin to continue to sort of clean them up a little bit and maybe redefine them a little bit or move things out that are not reflective of categories. So within NVIVO, you get something like this, which is these sort of broad categories, right? So the board of directors and the management practices and the resource attributes. And then within each one of these, those were those 4 elements there, right? Are the subcategories or the nested or the children that are associated with that. So this is what the data looks like when you begin to get into it and you begin to you clean it. I'm going to draw your attention to 2 other elements. This piece here where it talks about sources. So this is primarily what I'm going to talk about today. The number of managers that said this, that, or the other thing. The second piece is related to references, which is basically the number of times that we coded something. So managers could say all of these things. They could say a few of these things. They could say them often. And so what you see on one of these, for instance, if you look at human capital, you probably can't quite see it, but human capital was referenced by, we coded over 600 instances of some of these elements because people just kept talking about the people. Right? So managers say, oh, I got good people, oh, they're committed, and then 3 minutes later, 5 minutes later, they would start talking about their people in their organization and what a difference it makes. So this gives us a sense of salience, if you will, or power or importance to somebody, because they just kept bringing it up. Now, sometimes they would talk about something and they would bring it up and they would say, oh, we got good people, but I'm afraid I'm going to lose my people, right? So that would get coded twice, and we do pick up on some of those inferences of when somebody feels like it's a strength or an attribute versus when it was a weakness or something that they were concerned about. But those 2 things would both get coded into people. So that gives you a sense of what it looked like and what we've got in reference to the data. All right, so what did we find? So I'll put these tables up, but then I'll talk about each one of these, and then I'll give you the illustrative questions or comments or quotes so that you can sort of see the way that people talked about these things. But this gives you the sense about the number of managers that talked about it and the percentage of the 66, right? So if you look at those 4 resource attributes, you can see that just about everybody talked about their people. They also talked about their relationships, and they talked about money. And you can see the way that those balance off between each other. And I'll give you a sense of a flavor of what they were saying. So dedication, skills, commitment. So that's what keeps the agency moving, is the people that care for the people that we serve. So this is pretty straightforward. This is not that surprising. This is not necessarily a groundbreaking finding. But it is interesting when you begin to look at the way that nonprofits treat people in their organization. This is an area where there is potentially room for improvement. We talk about volunteer management as an area or an aspect in which organizations can continue to be more effective or more. So excellent people, without them, I could do nothing. Right. So this was very strong, very, very robust. clearly this was important to them, and clearly was basically was the first thing that most everybody talked about. Now, financial capital was financial money was talked by about 70 folks. In some ways, you might have expected that everybody would have talked about it, right? Why wouldn't somebody bring it up? And usually, though, that they were talking about is that it was typically when we push them. Well, what would it take for you to move up, or what are you worried about that's going to cause you to slip in your ranking in reference to effectiveness? And that's typically when they would bring up money. They would bring up money not as the first explanation about what they made a difference for them, but as a sort of backup about their capacity to be able to do something. The closest relationship typically was, if I had more people, if I had more money, I could hire more people to do more good. That was typically the relationship that they would talk about most consistently. And we got a diagram here, but you'll see that this is probably the area they were most concerned about, but it clearly was, well, you'll see the quotes, most significant is funding. There's no way around it. It's what it is, right? If we had more funds, we could reach more people and do more things. We have a few consistent donors, right? So this is giving you that sense about the extent to which they feel like they have ownership, or they can control the money that they need for their organization. Again, not too surprising, and in some ways we might have expected it to even be more robust. Physical assets, not a lot. Some people talked about it, but by and large people weren't talking, and it was mixed. Sometimes they would talk about the wonderful, beautiful new building that they had, or they would lament about some poor, shabby building that they had, and they wish they could get it cleaned up and get it more effective. This, in some ways, was a little bit of a surprise for me in reference to how much they talked about external relationships and how much they felt like that was important for their organization. And they talked about partnerships for services, but they also talked about the relationships with their donors. So, and maybe when the fact that this is related to resources picks up on some of this, but they would talk about both external relationships that they had, and they actually felt pretty good about these things as reflective of something that was valuable to them. So they would say, what makes you effective? The people in my organization. What else? The partnerships and the relationships that I have with other organizations in my community, or relationships that people know us and are aware of who we are and that they trust us, or these kinds of things that they would talk about. The external environment. Reputation might be another way that some of what this was capturing, although typically people didn't use that phrase. And then relationships among staff and between the executive and the board. Because we were talking to the executive, it's not too surprising, but that this came up quite a bit in reference to, I've got a good relationship with my board, it makes a difference. You'll hear a little bit here about the board in reference to the way that people are talking about the board. Social capital quotes in reference to external. Good relationships with other agencies, I've already get that. Support of key community leaders. Supportive of each other, and this is that quote here with the board in reference to, and how quickly, a little rocky at the start, but got better, and now that makes a big difference. So we've got our 4 management functions. Again, this is a little bit more detail, but we've got our 4 broad categories there, and then some of the elements within there, and I'll go into each one of those. So, there's the board of directors is the 5th one, and what they were saying about that. So you can see the number of individuals that stated it and the percentage of the total. And there they are on that in the visual. So this is human resource tasks and the board of directors. This is probably numbers, sorry. Not percentages, right? But you get an idea. So just about everybody talked about their board in one way or another as instrumental to, and that to me, although as somebody who studies boards, I shouldn't have been surprised. I actually was surprised how quickly they went to the board of directors in reference to the way the board works and what the board does. So not only did we talked about human capital, and human capital included, they would talk about their board members, particular things that board members would do, but they also talked about their board generally as a group and what it did for their organization, the way that they managed them. And for me, that was a little bit of a surprise at how quickly they went there to talk about the board. I mean, it reinforces what we talk about and what we say is important for managing our board. And it's a lot of work to deal with a board of directors, and it's something that many managers will not attend to. But this seemed to say these guys were, many of these individuals were quite worried about it and pretty concerned about how their board worked and what their board does. I'll just get into some of these a little bit. Generally, people were pretty positive about the way that they thought that they worked with teams. Again, one of the limitations of the study is we were just talking to that one individual, so we didn't get a chance to talk to the staff. Did they agree that that all of this was going on in such a positive and wonderful light? And again, it wasn't all positive, but there was a general sense that this was a positive attribute. Finding the right people and putting them in the right position was a kind of a nice illustrative quote there that captures the sentiment here that these individuals were saying. A few folks, a little over half, talk about procedures. A lot of people talking about efficiency. We're a very efficient organization. Why'd you rank yourself that way? Because we're really efficient. We do a good job in what the money that we have, we do a really good job. So, and a few individuals, not a lot, actually talked about their plans. A few individuals talked about that we have a plan and that helps us be able, I actually had expected that to come up stronger. So amongst all those elements that we had, I'd expected these to come up a little bit more, that to come up more often or more consistently. And again, that was really the model. I did not want to have my suppositions about what I expected people to say. A couple more, right? So open systems, so this was their ability to manage those relationships that they said that they had or didn't have. And in particular, the external relationships. This was an area where people struggled, in particular when they started talking about how they managed their fundraising or their ability to be able to raise funds. Again, it's not necessarily something incredibly surprising, but so a recent study just came out called Underdeveloped in reference to this idea that nonprofits do not have as sophisticated as systems as they really need to manage the external environment, either whether it's donors, whether it's networking. It was an area that they wanted to do better in, but there's a lot going on in that area, and it's difficult for an organization to be able to talk about that with a great deal of confidence that they could manage that effectively. Trying very hard, reaching out, managing relationships with my donors. I've been pretty good at it, keeping relationships going. We've got organizations around the state that we're working with and those kinds of references, examples of what they were talking about. This typically was a strength for them. They typically loved to talk about their programs. They would talk about it quite a bit. They felt pretty good about their programs. Typically they would talk about, well, I wish we could serve more people, but the people we do serve, I think we do a good job. And again, we didn't have an external measure here to be able to make judgments about did they really do that, but by and large you would see generally producing quality products. We're compassionate, or we're providing good services, really do benefit individuals. I mean, really. And again, a lot of people talking about their boards of directors as being critical or important. Typically they would say, they wouldn't get into a lot of detail, but they would talk about the board does what it needs to be able to do. Here are some of the things that seem to support that. There is definitely this sort of recurring concern in reference to the commitment of the individuals that are on the board, however. So this wasn't by any stretch of the imagination a positive element. This was a mixed area for these folks. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Very good. They do fundraising. If they could raise money, people were tended to be quite happy with them. And this was, by and large, this was a positive comment, but I thought it was kind of interesting, basically saying, I'm feeling pretty good. I've got half my people on the board, which is about what we hear, what we see, are able to do what needs to get done. So that's a pretty good reflection of what that was. So boards came up as more important than I had expected. Oh, this is the one that Richard put together for us, which sort of illustrates the positive and negative nature of some of these comments. So you can see here that people were lamenting the money, but by and large feeling pretty good about the people. Kind of mixed about the board, but by and large fairly positive. So when we looked at capacity drivers, it didn't necessarily matter if somebody was saying, I wish I had more money. They just saw that as an important feature or an attribute, for, at least the way we, this is an important feature or attribute. It just so happens that they don't have much of it or they need more. I'm not giving you a lot in that space, but just. So this was a quote that I guess if I had just talked to this person, I wouldn't have needed to do anything at all, because they actually captured it all in one nice sentence there. And again, for me, this affirmation or this sense that people were able to distill out some of these pieces. Success has to do with, being able to hire high-performing individuals, be able to do the fundraising, being able to build the relationships, and being able to engage my board is, for me and for the study, that illustrates pretty nicely those key capacity drivers that I was looking for in reference to, as we go out, we'll talk about next steps. As we go out, we don't have to ask 17 propositions. We can drill in a little bit on some of these elements, which was one of the main purposes of what we were trying to do. It also reinforces the things that we try to do for you all, right, in class in reference to what are some of the elements that you might want to try and be able to work on and trying to gain skills around, and what are organizations saying really makes a difference for these mid-size, small to mid-size, nonprofit human service organizations. This is the way this individual distilled it up, and it actually reflects pretty well with what we saw from everybody else. But it was kind of interesting they put it all in one sentence. And I believe we were able to verify the conceptual models. People do talk about resource attributes. They do talk about their people as distinct from what they try to do with them and how they try to manage them. That was an important piece that we wanted to look for. There is interconnectedness between resources and functions, and obviously some areas more than others. As we talked about sort of managing the external relationship and then the funding elements, those can get very confusing about whether it's something that they own or have in reference to an attribute or whether it's something that they manage or do. But there was distinction, and we could find those distinctions oftentimes within a particular sentence. And then we saw some of these in reference to the logic of the way people were putting some of these things. So this was an attempt to capture some of the, so the red being areas of concern, the gold being areas of feeling that those were elements of positive to them, and the gray was sort of a mixed element in reference to they have. But you would hear these linkages between money and people and services. I already gave you that. But the other one that people talked a lot about, if we could manage or deal with our external relationship, having to do with resource awareness or relationships, this facilitates our ability to secure resources. The board of directors and the relationships that they have externally is associated with our ability to secure resources. So there's some logic that goes on in the way that the interconnectedness between these components that also is captured here that we tried to be able to capture in the paper and talk a little bit about. So not only as distinct elements, because we'll talk about because we talk about class competencies, which is basically the linkages between some of these things and the way that you weave together different elements, management and resource attributes. Because that's really what happens for managers, right? Talked about these kind of as I was going along. It is a small sample. There was no universal pre-existing sort of measure of performance, but I didn't want to tell them necessarily what I was looking for. I really just wanted to hear about them. And next steps. We are moving on to a survey to try and explore these in a little bit more depth. We also want to explore manager sort of framing or their logic of what was going on, and the nature of those external relationships we're going to spend a little bit more time on as well. And I think, yeah, Joanna.
So,
Dr. Leahy.
When you started with the framing, you talked about like good quality or bad quality employees, good quality or bad quality management. I was wondering if there's any room in your model or your conceptual framework, not for necessarily just the high-low quality, but also for matches, like match between the human capital and match between the management, so that you can have good quality and good quality, but if they don't match, then the outcome might still be bad. Yeah, no, that's a good. Yeah, that's a good. We didn't. It's a good observation about the way that the management functions relate to the resource attributes and the linkage between those and the weaknesses there. Yeah, that would be an interesting thing to try and explore. Where would that
In the diagram, it doesn't really fit, right? So it really comes up, that's why I put this back up, because it's really this piece, and it's a little bit of where we're trying to go next, because we didn't push too hard. I think I'm more confident about the priorities that I want to explore, then I think I can explore those kinds of relationships a little bit more in more detail.
I think it would be something that the manager wouldn't be able to answer because they only see
It's tricky.
themselves. It's something that someone outside would have to.
Yeah, and you're right. I think that's part of what when we move forward, it's a little bit tricky to, how do you get people to explain the logic when sometimes they don't even necessarily fully understand it themselves? It's really just what they're doing. And so some of it is talking to them a little bit about what are you doing and how are you doing it. And with this background, I think I can get a little bit farther down that path. But yeah, I'm as interested in those relationships and the pieces that work together. But I felt like we needed to prioritize some things to look at first, which we could have done going into it, but this was a nice way to be able to explore it. Leonard, go on ahead.
So you look at your sample was a range of nonprofit organizations, kind of from $100,000 to well over $1 million, or somewhere over $1 million. Did you tease out your findings according to the ranges? I mean, I would imagine that a nonprofit that's $100,000 probably will look at their jobs a lot differently than a CEO or someone of a multi-million dollar.
Yeah, no, a good observation. We did, I didn't put it into this slide, and if anything, we probably went a little bit too small, because those very small organizations are substantively different than the larger organizations. We didn't have a lot of really big ones, but even just a $4 or $5 million organization is pretty substantively. So if I were to do it again, I think I would have pulled that up, that bottom level up a little bit. We wanted to get enough organizations, which is always a bit of a challenge, within a particular set of human service kind of categories without getting too far afield. We didn't want to get into arts organizations or some of these other kinds. Yeah, so I mean, from reflection, the most obvious being those smaller organizations were much quicker to talk about weaknesses in reference to finances. Right? So that came up really fast, really consistently. They also were more concerned about their board and the way that the board was able to function. And where the large organizations rarely talked about money as being something that they were concerned about. And they were less likely to talk about concerns with their board, but then to talk about, yes, we rely on our board is important. Yeah. And we did a little bit of comparison between the Houston and the South to try and, but there wasn't too much there. There was some distinctions between the way that the folks in Houston talk about external relationships. They were a little less likely to talk about external relationships than the folks in the south part of the state where it's a little more rural. Lori, Dr. Paulberg.
So this is almost following up on Leonard's, but I'm really intrigued that everybody thinks that they're doing really well and really strong performers. So do you think it's a two-part question, so do you think that's valid, and maybe those are just the people who are willing to talk to you? Both,
right? So one is, yes, that it's some of those would be the people who are willing to talk to us, because one guy marked it way down on a 1 on the thing, and I thought, oh my God, who's going to talk to me about this? And he got it wrong on the scale. He meant to put himself at a 7, of course. Yeah, it really was. I'm really up at the top. No, that was a mistake. Is it real? No, I mean, for them it was perhaps. I can give you the illustration of the most extreme example that I could think of. It was a relatively small organization, and it was pretty much an outlier. She ranked herself pretty high in reference to how the organization was performing. When it got down to it, they were really providing services to about 15 to 20 people. And she thought they were doing a pretty good job, but even as we got into that a little bit, it unpacked pretty quickly, and it got to be a very awkward conversation on the phone as you began to say, well, what did you mean? So that was definitely an outlier. I didn't see anything that extreme, but that idea that people would tend to elevate or talk about, we serve, so one of the organizations in the south part of the state said, we serve about 25% of such and such a population, of the elderly or the kids or such and such and so on. Of those 25%, we think we do a pretty good job. And we think we provide a range of services and we have good volunteers. So is that an effective organization or not? They tended to say, within these constraints of who I am and way I operate, I feel pretty good about what we're doing and the level of things that we're providing for the clients. But we could do more, or we could serve more people. And so the most common area, so then the question is it really high quality? And what does it mean if you serve a relatively distinct subpopulation of the need that you know exists in a community? Is that an effective organization? That tended to be the most obvious distinction with somebody. They could settle in and say, I'm pretty happy with what we're doing with these people, but I wish we could do more. Is that?
Well, I guess my follow-up question is, if you had been able to do a in search of excellence or built to last study and pull out those truly high-performing organizations, do you think your findings would have been different?
Well, I mean, the study that high impact organizations, the book there by Crutchfield and Grant, boards didn't come up necessarily, and that was one that was in my mind in reference to the people come up. Yes, that's pretty consistent. So I don't know, and I think that's an interesting question. I think I was just as curious about the run-of-the-mill organizations and the way that they were, more or less run-of-the-mill organizations and the way they were describing what they did. Yeah.
So did you find it more crucial that it's the board that really makes the program organization run, or is it the people underneath? So it's like a top-down or a bottom-up to make a good organization run?
It was both, and I think a lot of times people look to the board to help facilitate the resource environment. And if they could get their board to do that, made a big difference for them, because they struggle so much in the resource development domain. And we got good people, like one of the things we'd hear, we got good people to provide good services. If we can get more money, then I'm going to be more successful. And if the board does some of that for me, then that makes a big difference. So it was both functioning together. It wasn't one or the other. There was the element in reference to the board helps set direction or guides our organization, provides some oversight. That was a little bit less common, but they did talk about that as well. Yeah.
At the beginning, you were talking about, of all the different factors that can affect an organization's effectiveness, there's the contextual ones and then the more operating ones.
Right.
And you focus on the second. But I was just curious, as you were coding and going through the conversations, did you see some evidence that directors were aware of some of those bigger picture forces that affected their
I expected more, I expected more people to talk about competition or some other environmental factors. We got some of that, but they weren't extremely quick to jump to that as an explanation. It was there, and it was on that NVIVO coding scheme. If you saw, there was a little category there. People talked about a competitive environment, or we're a poor community would be the other thing that they would talk about. And so it's difficult in this space to raise money, right? And that's real. And so, yeah, but it wasn't really, really strong. Like, I had expected people to jump there a little quicker. Well, we're not quite as effective as we could be because it's really competitive, or there isn't a whole lot of money in this community. And they wouldn't jump there quite as fast as I thought. Yeah.
So I have two questions. The first, they rank themselves on how good they are in terms of performance or effectiveness?
The question said effectiveness. How effective are you on a scale of 1 to 7? And we let them, right? This is a la Dave Rentz and Herman, and let them decide what that meant for them.
So did they provide any definition of what effective?
We asked them what was the criteria you used, and the most common explanation was related to we provide good services, or we provide services. We meet a need in our community. We fulfill our mission. That would be the phrases and the language that they would use. If you push too hard, typically they couldn't give you much more than that, though, in reference to their criteria. What they would do if you pushed harder, they would start to launch into the things that they do and the people that they have and how hard they work.
Is that more common among a specific group, or is it across the board?
Amongst the group that we talked to, that was pretty common.
Small organizations versus, as well as big ones.
Right.
Okay, so my other question is when it comes to volunteers.
Okay.
They are the human capital of the organization. That's how they are considered.
Right, so if we've got a good volunteers who are dedicated and committed to our organization, that would be considered human capital. If they talked about the human resource or the volunteer management systems and processes that they have, that was the management functions. And we distinguish between the two, people and the management functions that they did. Yeah, HS.
For the further research, do you plan to interview clients? Because you interviewed only executives, they may overestimate themselves. They positive.
I'm sure they do. I don't at this point have a plan to get all the way to the clients. It would be an interesting, to try and get at the performance measure at a way that was a little more objective. But I don't at this point have that on the slate. But it would be a good idea.
I was interested, you said some of them mentioned sort of efficiency and procedures and following plans that they had laid out as being really important. Did they mention the process of developing those plans at all, or?
Sometimes.
I mean, it's kind of easy to follow plans if you lay out plans that are easy to follow.
Right.
And so that's one question. It's whether you know what these plans are. And I can be very effective at following plans to eat chocolate every day, for example. The other question is, did any of them mention transparency in their records or their operations or anything like that as evidence of their, or as something you could look to for evidence of their effectiveness?
All right, so the first one, I was looking for plans, strategic plans, some version of that I thought would come up much more predominantly than it did. And it wasn't an immediate explanation, because I typically think about an organization thinking about having sufficient capacity and then coming up with a plan to try and address something and then trying to implement that and going through a good process of coming up with a good plan and those kinds of things. There wasn't a ton of conversation about those, and when the conversation did come up, it typically was related to the way that they provide programs and activities. So it was very sort of what I'll call business level planning for the organization, or program planning. And then the second question was transparency. Other than what they would talk about being a trusted organization or well-respected organization, they didn't talk about how necessarily, they didn't talk about transparency or the fact that they made things available to people who asked for it as the way that they gained that trust. It was very much more social. It was, we're trusted because people know us and I know them, and so then they support us and they believe in us. It was that kind of transparency rather than, we're reporting documents or measuring outcomes, kinds of things. That people did not talk about that, which is also an interesting finding, because that would have been one of the things we would have looked for. We were looking for. Ben.
How well do you think the results can be applied to organizations in other states?
I think so, because we did Houston, the city, and a rural region. I think so. I think the one that's curious to me is the external relationships, because there was some difference between what people were talking about in Houston versus what they were talking about in the south part of the state, and the way people talk about those in other places would be interesting. Some places probably going to be more networked and that's going to come up more prominent. Some places it's going to be less so. So that would be one that would, I mean, some of the other features I think would be pretty robust. Yeah.
Can you go back to the model, please?
Yeah. Way back. Sorry. Nope. This one?
Yeah, probably the one before. Basically the social capital.
Oh, the slide on social capital?
So, where do you think the values of the organization, their accountability mechanisms or interest in accountability, and talking about transparency as well, where do these fall? Because those actually do impact their capacity to a great extent, and they need to manage these kind of, relationships.
Values. Yeah, we are. Would it be the phrase "we're successful because of what we stand for" kind of idea? Is that what you're?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know exactly. I mean, it didn't come up enough.
Is that part of social capital, do you think, or what is it? Is it something else? Or value capital?
Could be, right? People talked about their mission. They talked about, yeah, we're that was as a criteria of effectiveness. So it came up a little bit there, but people didn't necessarily talk about their values or their philosophical, and I don't want to read too much into your question, their philosophical approach to what they did. It didn't come up, and I don't know exactly, to be honest with you, to me it would come up in more of the management functions and the way that they distill core culture, or we looked for culture. We expected the culture would come up as a management function. Typically, we would put that in HR, the way that we build a culture for our organization. And some of that's reflected in the bonding relationships amongst the individuals in the organization. This is another example where sometimes it's really difficult to say, what is social capital distinct from human capital from the culture of the organization. Those things are can be pretty closely aligned with each other. So that's where if somebody's talked about, we have a good values proposition, everybody agrees with our values, or everybody's a proponent of our values, that would have probably come up in the human resource element.